We're very lucky today to have Karim Sadjadpour with us. He really is one of this country's top analysts on Iran. He's an associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before at Carnegie, he was the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group based in Tehran and Washington, D.C. I believe he covered the last election, 2004 election for ICG. He's a recipient of many academic awards, including a Fulbright Scholarship. He's been named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he's a board member of the Banu Foundation. Welcome, Karim. The title of this session is How to Engage Iran, but I want to begin with the events of the past 4 weeks, which has obviously had us all spellbound, the so-called Green Revolution. It's clearly been the most serious crisis for the Islamic Republic in its 30-year history. A total of 33 million people have hit the streets, according to the mayor of Tehran, protesting the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, going through the streets chanting Makbar Dictator or Death to the Dictator, and mobilizing through social networks like Twitter and Facebook, and going up on the rooftops at night chanting Allah Akbar. And it seemed to materialize almost out of nowhere by spontaneous combustion. And my first question for you, Karim, is where did this come from? How did this happen? Who were the key elements of this movement?
Sure. First, it's really an honor to be here among such illustrious company. I'm very humbled to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I always like to, there's an anecdote about Iran which really captures for me the mood in contemporary Iranian society. Because what I say is that the outrage and the outburst we've seen in the last few weeks has not been brewing only the last 4 years under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency. It's really been brewing the last 30 years. And several years ago when I was based in Tehran, I was driving in a taxi, and I always tell people that if you base your analysis of Iranian politics only on Tehran taxi drivers, you could predict a revolution next week. Because Tehran taxi drivers have a very difficult job. They're constantly in traffic and ingesting pollution. And many Tehran taxi drivers are former revolutionaries themselves, disillusioned revolutionaries now. And I was driving in this taxi cab, and I looked up at the street sign, and I noticed we were on a street called Khalid Islambuli Street. And some of you may know that Khalid Islambuli is the guy who killed Anwar Sadat. And the Iranian regime named the street after this guy because Anwar Sadat was a good friend of the Shah of Iran. And this remains a reason why there's no relations, official relations between Egypt and Iran. So I was curious to get this driver's reaction, and I said, do you know who Khalid Islambuli was? He said, no idea. I said, it's the guy who killed Anwar Sadat. And he was really outraged. You know, what type of a government we have that names streets after assassins? Egypt is a great nation. We need to have relations with Egypt. Truly outraged. And, you know, unwittingly, I got him very worked up, and I was concerned about his driving capabilities. So I said, take the next right, you know, any right, doesn't matter. And he looked up at the street sign. The next street was Bucharest Street, Bucharest, the capital of Romania. And he looked at me with outrage, and he said, who did this bastard Bucharest kill? And I say this because this is the perception you have, the kind of eroded legitimacy of this regime, which I said has not been brewing only the last 4 years, but the last 30 years. And this sense of discontent transcends age. Iran is a very young population, 2/3 under 33, but it transcends age. It transcends religiosity. It transcends gender. It transcends geographic location. And as I said, it had been brewing for a long time. And if we look at only the last 4 years, well, I covered these elections, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's election in 2005 very closely. And his mandate when he was elected in 2005 was very clear. It wasn't to deny the Holocaust or to be belligerent toward Israel. He was going to be the president that would put the oil money on people's dinner tables. And he's failed miserably in doing that. Inflation has doubled under his stewardship. Unemployment has gone up. So the notion that Ahmadinejad had 5.7 million votes in 2005, and he would somehow multiply that fivefold in 2009 to get 25 million votes, was, I think, a real insult to the Iranian people. And I can tell you that I didn't anticipate this type of uprising, but I have not been able to go to Tehran the last 4 years. And people who are there just told me, you can only imagine that when 3 million people collectively take to the streets, are risking their lives, the government's shock troops, the Basij militia, Ansar Hezbollah, is using indiscriminate violence against these people. But still people are taking to the streets. You can only imagine the depth of people's sense of injustice and people's sense of outrage. And just briefly, you want me to talk about the elections and whether or not they were rigged. What I would say is that these elections were conducted under a cloud of improprieties. To give you an idea, the two government entities that are tasked with overseeing the fairness of these elections, the Interior Ministry and the Guardian Council, both of their heads publicly endorsed Ahmadinejad before the election. 40 million votes were cast. These votes have to be hand counted. And with 4 hours left before the polls closed, the government declared that Ahmadinejad was the winner. Another example is that Mir Hossein Mousavi is an ethnic Azeri, an Azeri Turk. Yet he overwhelmingly lost his hometown province of Iranian Azerbaijan to Ahmadinejad. And I tell people it's kind of as plausible as Barack Obama losing the African-American vote to John McCain in 2008.
I think the other opposition candidate, Karoubi, also lost his own district.
Karoubi also overwhelmingly lost his home province. And I was kind of listing, I was doing an op-ed about all the improprieties which took place. And then I got an email from my friend Tom Friedman who said, listen, if I genuinely won an election 2-1 against anyone, I would agree to a recount any place, any time. And I think that sums it up right there. If you genuinely won an election 2-1, your reaction shouldn't be to impose martial law and imprison all of the opposition.
One of the things that I think struck a lot of people about the nature of the movement itself and the people that were out on the streets was the predominance of women and the role of women. In a lot of ways, women have been at the vanguard of the opposition, haven't they? Can you explain that?
Well, such an important point. And what we were talking about earlier is that if you look at the iconic images of the 1979 revolution, they're middle-aged, bearded, traditional men. And the iconic images of this protest movement are these young, educated females. And it's quite remarkable. Roger Cohen from the New York Times has done some wonderful reporting on this. And he's documented how women have been the vanguard of these movements and have been on the streets fighting and have kind of chastised their male counterparts for not being outspoken and braver. So I think that whether change comes to Iran in the next months or years or whatever, women truly are going to be the vanguard of the reform movement. And what's transpired the last 30 years, the role of women has been somewhat paradoxical because the female rights, women's rights, from a legal perspective, have been significantly curtailed since 1970.
Well, aren't their value is exactly one half that of a man?
Exactly.
Legally.
Their inheritance and they can't be judges. Someone like Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel laureate, she was a judge during the time of the Shah, and she was demoted to being a secretary post-revolution. So their legal standing has decreased dramatically. But what's transpired is that when the country was at war, the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, whereas 2 generations of Iranian men spent their formative years, instead of going to high school or university, they spent their formative years on the battlefield, women went to university. And women are now 60% of university students. So it's this very paradoxical situation where women are more advanced than men in terms of their educational standing. But in terms of their legal standing, they're inferior to men.
Another thing that struck me as interesting during particularly for the first 2 weeks of the uprising, when every single day you had these enormous crowds on the streets, the regime almost seemed paralyzed, even though they had been, it was almost like it was their worst nightmare, and they'd been clearly thinking about this. I mean, concerned about the Orange Revolution and this and that revolution. They were always very concerned about and accusing the West of fomenting a Velvet Revolution. Yeah. I mean, it's clearly something they saw coming. But they still seemed paralyzed until, I think it was June 19th, when the Supreme Leader came out and really blasted the opposition and reaffirmed his support for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and then obviously the subsequent crackdown. Appears the streets have quieted down. A simple question is, do you think that the opposition movement has been crushed?
I think the regime never anticipated this type of popular reaction. They thought they could act with impunity. And as I said, this, I think, for many people was truly the last insult. And one thing this regime, I think if they have one redeeming quality, they do repression quite well. They have repression down to a science. And what I tell people is that the scale of the demonstrations has decreased. The mayor of Tehran, who is himself fairly hardliner, a former senior commander in the Revolutionary Guards, estimated that 3 million people took to the streets. And I tell people, if 3 million took to the streets and risked their lives, you can only imagine the millions of people at home who had solidarity with those people. But what the regime does to prevent large amounts of people from congregating in one area is they block off the major highways and thoroughfares. So just to give you a vision of the city of Tehran, it's much more like Los Angeles than it is Manhattan. It's not a small concentrated area where people can congregate in one area by walking. You have to drive miles oftentimes. So the regime will simply create roadblocks. So mass amounts of people can't congregate in one place. And so what we saw instead after the large rallies was these smaller pockets of protest throughout the city, which were more manageable for them. Now, it's very useful to get inside the head or under the turban of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And what's interesting is that he has the hindsight of having been a former revolutionary, successful revolutionary 30 years ago against the Shah. And one of the tenets of his worldview, this is both in terms of his domestic policy orientation, but also his foreign policy orientation, is that you never compromise when you're under pressure. Never compromise when you're under siege, because that's not going to allay the pressure. It's going to project weakness and invite even more pressure. And there was an incredible quote I once found from Hashemi Rafsanjani, who ironically is now in the opposition. And he said something very interesting, very insightful for me. He said that the Shah in late 1978 came on television and he apologized for past sins and past transgressions. And he said, "I've heard the voice of your revolution." And the Shah thought by doing that he was going to appease the crowds and pacify the crowds. But Rafsanjani said, on the contrary, that's when we smelled blood and we pounced because we projected weakness. And so for me, it was very predictable that Khamenei was going to come out unequivocally and use unequivocal force. And there's a couple important distinctions between the current leadership in Iran and the Shah's leadership. One point about the Shah's leadership was that many of them had spent their formative years or were educated in Europe or the United States. So when the going got tough, they could live outside of Iran. They could pack up and move to LA or Bethesda or the south of France. These mullahs, spent their formative years in Qom, in the seminaries of Qom, and the Revolutionary Guardsmen spent their formative years on the battlefield with Iraq. So it's always been said that these guys are not going to give up Iran very easily. They're prepared to use massive force. And I think that what we're going to see is the regime will continue to project force. And the question is...
What are you hearing from Iran in terms of the level and the degree of repression going on right now? Because most journalists, Western journalists, have been thrown out of the country.
The video footage I see is truly harrowing. To give you an idea of this Basij militia, the way they operate, the more militant of these Basij militia, I kind of compare them to a cross between the Hells Angels and Al-Qaeda. I mean, they're on these motorbikes, and their eyes it's like they're truly looking for a fight. And they use violence indiscriminately. There's video footage of a 7-year-old being beaten up, women being beaten up. This poor woman, Neda Soltani, who was shot at close range in the heart. And then her death was blamed on the CIA and the BBC. So they're willing to use indiscriminate
violence. In that order.
Exactly, yeah. So they are willing to use indiscriminate violence. The question is, as time passes, will we start to see cleavages within entities like the Revolutionary Guards? These are 120,000 men. And certainly the senior commanders who are appointed by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei are going to remain loyal to him. But by all accounts, we have a lot of evidence, both anecdotal and statistical, that the rank and file of the Revolutionary Guards are more reflective of Iranian society at large. And are they going to be willing to continue to repress popular sentiment? That, I think, is something that the regime is concerned about.
And how long do you think they can contain this? I mean, is it indefinitely through force? Or?
What's happened is that the opposition has entered a new phase. And instead of flexing their muscles on the street with these street protests, I think they're now going to try to target important arteries of the Iranian economy, similar to what we saw in the late 1970s with trying to get the bazaar, the merchant classes, to go on strike, the oil industry, oil ministers to go, the Ministry of Petroleum to go on strike, laborers, bus drivers. I think that's what they're attempting to do. The problem at the moment is that the bulk of the opposition is either imprisoned or under house arrest, or they have no means to communicate. But I tell people that the scale of the demonstration certainly has decreased, but don't think that people's sense of injustice and sense of outrage has decreased. Chris and I were talking earlier, and I was telling him that I've been communicating with a lot of people in Tehran and elsewhere, and it's really remarkable for me to talk to people who in the past were very staunch defenders of the government, who are saying now that these fascists must go. They use this term. This was a term that the Bush administration used, or it was common during the Bush administration to use this term, Islamo-fascist. And no one liked to hear it. But this is the term that people who in the past were staunch defenders of this government are now using. So I'm not predicting any profound change necessarily in the next weeks and months. But what I can tell you is that I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to go back to the status quo ante. And again, the depth of people's outrage and sense of discontent and sense of injustice, I think remains very high.
So you think something has really changed?
Truly. I mean, sacred red lines have been crossed. For people to go out into the streets the day after the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, endorses these elections and calls them divinely endorsed, and tells people essentially that if you go out into the streets, we've authorized the use of force against you. And you have the next day 100,000 people go to the streets with chants, as you said, of Marg bar dictator, death to the dictator. This is truly unprecedented.
Talk to us a little bit more about your view on the split that's occurred inside the regime, or the deep state, as they call it. I think we've known that there were debates before, and there's debates here about whether the debate there is real or whether it's not real. But it does seem, at least from the events of the last a month or so, that these are real differences, and that there are real both personality differences and policy differences. How do you see the kind of the internal factions breaking down at this point?
Well, that's another thing that's unprecedented about this moment, that we haven't seen this scale of popular uprisings, and we haven't seen these political fissures which currently exist now. If you were to tell me 5 years ago that one day Hashemi Rafsanjani, who was one of the pillars of the 1979 revolution, who was the individual who made Ayatollah Khamenei the supreme leader, if you were to tell me that one day he's going to be in the opposition, I would say you're crazy. Or Mir Hossein Mousavi himself, who was prime minister for 8 years during the 1980s, who was much closer to Ayatollah Khamenei, the father of the revolution, than the current supreme leader is, that he is going to be, in the opposition. I would say, this is crazy. So truly, the fissures we're seeing at the level of the political elite are unprecedented. Among the senior clergy, the Grand Ayatollahs, only 1 of 12 has endorsed this election. And what's transpired is that, what I would argue is that post-election, the opposition is demanding much more than they were pre-election. Pre-election, I think Mousavi and others were calling for change within the confines of the Islamic system. No one was questioning the legitimacy of the institution of the supreme leader. No one was questioning the legitimacy of Ayatollah Khamenei himself. But as I said, now people are calling for far more profound change than they were pre-election. And I just wonder, if from the vantage point of Ayatollah Khamenei, if he wouldn't have been much better off just acquiescing on the election without, trying to concoct the results.
But I believe it was today, one of the leading hardline newspapers, Kayhan, came out with an editorial recommending that the leaders of the opposition, including Mousavi himself, be put on trial. Do you see an effort going forward by the hardliners to neutralize and, if necessary, put on trial the opposition figures?
This repression I think is politically costly for the regime and is financially costly. When I say it's politically costly, what we've seen transpire over the last few weeks is not more people supporting Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, it's less people. And the tent, the umbrella of the opposition is increased in numbers. Again, when you have former President Khatami ostensibly under house arrest, Mousavi under house arrest, and many of the people who were running the government or in Khatami's government from 1997 to 2005, currently in prison with still a fairly large following, it's going to be very difficult to sustain that over a long period. When I say it's financially costly, what we see now is that the regime has been, it takes money to have hundreds of thousands of policemen and Basij militia on the streets every day providing security. That's not cheap. It takes money to consistently jam these satellite television broadcasts from Voice of America, BBC Persian, CNN, to limit people's access to information. A friend of mine was telling me that it's about $10,000 per minute for the regime to jam these satellite broadcasts to prevent people from information. Just remarkable when you think about it. $600,000 per hour that the government has been spending over the course of the last 3 weeks to limit people's access to information. And this is for a situation where oil prices have decreased. There's tremendous economic malaise. This is going to be very costly for them, both politically and financially, to sustain for many, many months.
Well, it takes us into the next question, which is when President Obama came into office, one of the first things he did and one of the first ways in which he wanted to show that his administration was going to be different than the prior administration was to announce a very public effort to engage Iran directly into talks. I believe you were also an advocate of engaging Iran. In what way do you think the events of the last 4 weeks have changed that, and do you still think it makes sense for us to try to engage Iran in direct talks?
Well, what I would say is that I think what's transpired in Iran over the course of the last few weeks in terms of the popular uprising and the political fissures, I don't believe would have transpired during the Bush administration. And the reason why I say that is that I think that the Bush administration's approach kind of united Iran's disparate political factions against a common threat. People who hated Ahmadinejad during the Bush administration bit their tongue. They said, for the sake of national security, etc. I think what the Obama administration's approach has done has accentuated these existing cleavages amongst political elites between a small minority that wants to continue this death to America culture of 1979 and the vast majority of certainly the population, but I would even argue the majority of the political elite, who understand that Iran will never fulfill its enormous potential as long as relations with the United States remain so adversarial. I was talking to a fairly senior, kind of pragmatic conservative official in a meeting in Jordan a couple months ago. And he told me in private that there's been tremendous pressure, this was before the election, there's been tremendous pressure on the hardliners in Tehran to justify this gratuitous enmity towards the United States. And he said something very interesting. He said, listen, if Iran can't make peace with a US president called Barack Hussein Obama, who's preaching mutual respect on a weekly basis and sending us Nowruz greetings, it's pretty obvious the problem lies in Tehran, not Washington. And I think this was the genius of the Obama administration's approach, is to remove that pretext that so many of these authoritarian governments around the world had during the Bush-Cheney era, whether it was Iran or Syria or Venezuela, to say it was simply a reaction to US measures. They don't have that pretext anymore. And it became clear to the Iranian people, to the political elite, and I think to the rest of the world, that Tehran is the impediment, not Washington. Now, as you said, in my short career, I've always advocated dialogue and engagement with Iran. I don't think that's the right approach right now for the foreseeable future. I think that it would be sending the wrong message to the regime. Just as the Obama administration correctly has not wanted to insert themselves into this momentous Iranian, internal Iranian drama which is unfolding for fear of emboldening or hurting those whom are seeking to help. I think if we were to come out and say, okay, the last 3 weeks aren't really important, it transpired, and let's continue dialogue and engagement, you're going to demoralize the millions of people who risk their lives and the opposition themselves who say, America is now negotiating with these guys, it's over for us. So I think that there may come a time in the next months where we'll have to reconsider our approach. But I think in the short term, our message shouldn't be that, let's continue with engagement. I think for the first time, I would argue that the costs of engagement outweigh the benefits. And on the contrary, what I would say is that the Europeans should follow our lead on this one, and they should take a more hardline approach, isolation approach. We don't need belligerent rhetoric, axis of evil and things like that. There's no need for that. We should continue to take the high road rhetorically. But I would like to see the Europeans send a similar signal to Iran. I would like to see...
What would you do, for example, in the case of the staffer in the British Embassy who may go on trial? The EU has been discussing how they could respond to that, including some harsh measures like withdrawing all of their ambassadors. What would you recommend that they do in that situation?
I would advocate that. I would advocate that they pull out their ambassadors, because the Iranians don't take the Europeans seriously. They think that the Europeans, at the end of the day, whatever happens, they don't have much of a backbone, and they're always going to say, well, let's continue with dialogue and engagement, and they feel they can act with impunity.
And the EU, I think, is their largest trading partner, isn't it?
It is their largest trading partner, yeah. Although gradually China has filled that vacuum, but certainly the EU is a critical relationship with Iran. And if it's only the UK, I think it's problematic. I would like to see a collective effort by all the Europeans take this measure. And frankly, I would like to see non-Western democracies like Japan, South Africa, India, Turkey send similar signals to Iran. I don't want to be to exaggerate or be hyperbolic in this moment, but I've never been. I think all of us, all Iranians and people who follow Iran around the world, recognize that this is truly an unprecedented moment. And if there were change, profound change to happen in Iran, I don't exaggerate when I say it could profoundly change the Middle East, but not only the Middle East, but also the world. I see it on a similar scale, and this will sound hyperbolic to many of you, but I see this on a similar scale to a potential collapse of the Soviet Union, in the way that kind of a responsible, democratic, tolerant Iran could change the world.
Well, what's also interesting, I think, is the implication for the United States if there was to be a change of that nature, because most of the people of Iran are not anti-American. The anti-American thing is definitely a thing of the past there. And when I was there the last time, we did a tour of the former U.S. Embassy, which is now a museum. It's called the Spy Den, and it's now a museum. They have various little dioramas like CIA guys, mannequins looking at a table in a secure facility, and it's a little comical. But there's nobody in it. I mean, no Iranians are interested in visiting the Spy Den. It has just no interest to them at all. They were thrilled to see us. That was just a small indication that there just is there seems to be absolutely no interest in among the people in pursuing that. So that if there was to be a change, I think it would probably be positive for the United States.
It's a very good point, and I always tell people that Iran is the only country in the Middle East, in the Islamic Middle East, that when there's popular uprisings, the United States is hopeful about them. Every other country in the Middle East, if there's a popular uprising, you're concerned that the alternative to the status quo could be much worse. If popular uprisings happen in Egypt or Morocco or Saudi Arabia, you're not thinking it's the secular Democrats who are going to be on the ascent. You're concerned it's the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamists. But Iran, by virtue of the fact that they've been ruled by a repressive Islamist system the last 3 decades, the population doesn't romanticize about kind of a pure Islamic society. And I think from this perspective, the political maturity of Iranian population stands out by Middle East standards. People have very pragmatic demands, greater political voice, greater social freedoms, more economic opportunities. And a friend of mine, Afshin Molavi, who works with the New America Foundation, has this quip that he says, all people who love Mahmoud Ahmadinejad have one thing in common, and that is they don't live in Iran. It's kind of that, it reminds me of this, as a student of Latin America when I was in college, of Latin American popular romanticism of Castro's Cuba. There was this defiant political order which people admired from afar, but which they didn't really wish upon themselves. And what's interesting is that in empirical polls, when people are asked which leaders in the region you most admire, oftentimes they'll say, Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran, and Khalid Mishal of Hamas, although their popularity has decreased substantially over the last year. But when you ask the follow-up question to that, and you say, okay, these are the leaders you most admire. Now, where in the region would you most like to live? No one says South Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran. They say Dubai usually. So I think that even, that again, there's this romanticism of Iran that exists in the Arab world, but it's a romanticism they admire from afar, which they don't really wish upon themselves, in my opinion.
Talk briefly about what the Obama administration can do if they're not going to engage Iran. Are there things that this administration can do, you think, to help the forces in the opposition, or are there things that could be done that short of sanctions, or would you advocate sanctions? What do you think? What kind of tools do you think are available to the administration?
Well, I always tell the people, the folks I speak to in the administration and the Congress, is that I defer to the leaders of the Iranian opposition themselves. And if they continue to say that this is an internal Iranian battle and moral support is fine, but we don't want the U.S. To insert itself, then I think they know themselves best, what's obviously best for them. I do think there are certain measures that can be taken behind the scenes, which could be beneficial to the cause, to help people. One is simply access to information. So when the regime is blocking people's access to outside information, I think there's maybe certain technology we can use to help them out. As they're jamming satellite signals, we should be able to help them out. I think there's certain ways of, when the government has shut down internet activity, I think there's certain ways of increasing kind of people's access to the internet. I would also argue that, again, greater action from the Europeans could be very helpful, leaning on our European allies and our democratic non-Western allies, Japan, South Africa, India, Turkey. And what I would say in the short term could be much more powerful than economic sanctions, because economic sanctions oftentimes take a while to take hold. Oftentimes you're hurting the people more than you are the government. The artery of this regime is oil. The economic artery of this regime is oil. And as I said, it's financially costly to retain this scale of repression. I think Tom Friedman had a wonderful piece talking about the need for a green revolution in the United States and switching to alternative energies. I think that's right on, but it's not a short-term plan that we can get oil prices down. The one thing we can do, the one country which can help out in the short term of bringing down oil prices is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has no love lost for President Ahmadinejad. And if they were to increase their output, they have 4 million barrels spare capacity now. If they were to increase their output dramatically and there was a precipitous decline in oil prices, I think this would be very difficult for the regime to endure.
You suggested that to the Saudis?
Perhaps, yeah.
Okay. Before we open it up, I just want to hit what is often considered the primary issue for the United States in terms of our national security, which is the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians continue to insist it's a peaceful nuclear program, but it has all the earmarks of a weapons program because of their emphasis on the enrichment on the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, which gives them the capability to produce enriched uranium to produce nuclear weapons. They've now got close to 6,000 operating centrifuges, and they're well on the way to ramping that up even more substantially. How do we, if we're not going to engage them directly, or even if we were down the road to engage them directly, what in your view is the best way to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
It's a great question, and what I would say is that, again, in the short term, there's no indication that the regime, in fact, they've been very explicit in saying that they're not interested in any compromise on the nuclear issue. They've told the Europeans that if the Europeans expect them to come to the negotiating table, the Europeans will first have to apologize for European comments about the election. So in the short term, I don't see any benefits of simply going to the table and hearing the Iranians say, we're not going to compromise at all. But again, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, if the regime manages to hold on, consolidate power, I think that not only on the nuclear issue, but Iran has, Iran is integral to 6 major U.S. foreign policy challenges. There's the nuclear issue, there's Iraq, Afghanistan, Arab-Israeli peace, terrorism, and energy security. So ignoring Iran, not engaging, is not an option indefinitely. I totally understand that. And what I would say is that what concentrates minds in Tehran, again, is not an amplification of existing U.S. sanctions, but it's if the Iranians get up in the morning and they say, wow, not the Chinese and the Russians are ignoring our phone calls, the Indians. When they begin to see that their actions are alienating much of the world, I think this is going to concentrate minds. What I would say in the past, before these elections, is that Iran's nuclear ambitions are in a way a byproduct of U.S.-Iran relations. Especially I would say this during the Bush administration, that if we're able to change Iran's threat perception vis-a-vis the United States, they may recalculate, recalibrate their nuclear ambitions. I fear now that what they may have in mind is the North Korea model, that if we've eroded our legitimacy, this is the way we can try to regain it. And what I would simply say, this is going to be a very difficult negotiation. What I would say, though, is that I'm opposed to any type of military action. I know that's talked about a lot. But in a way, I think that I would argue, this sounds like a throwaway comment, but I think that for someone like Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, military action would be more of a carrot than a stick. And if you go back to 1980, when the revolution was in its infancy, one of the reasons the Khomeinis were able to consolidate power is Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, and everyone kind of united under the umbrella of nationalism and national security. And I fear the same potential result, that if Iran is attacked, then all bets are off. And this moment we've seen the last 3 weeks, we may unwittingly soil it.
Okay, well, I think that's a great start. There was a former State Department official, Tom Pickering, once said that no country has caused us more heartburn over the past 30 years than Iran. And I think your conversation today has certainly echoed that. Let's, do we have some microphones set up here? If we could maybe have people start to line up, and we'll take a few questions. Sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Finsale, and I work for the International Center for Transitional Justice and previously served for the Truth Commission in South Africa. And a great admirer of your analysis and thoughts on Iran, and I find myself in almost total agreement with you. I wanted to ask a question about track 2 efforts, because what you referred to is formal engagement from the US government to the Iranian government. And I know there's been some rather interesting track 2 developments which have been underway recently. And what do you think? Is there a space for track 2 developments? Do you think that those get shut down as well? And might that be a profitable area to explore?
It's an important question. And what I would say, I've participated in a lot of these track 2 discussions over the last 5 years. And the problem, especially in the last few years, has been that the representatives from Iran have been kind of the people we've agreed with, university professors in Tehran who are fairly like-minded. They haven't been the representatives of the Revolutionary Guards and Ahmadinejad's government. And I remember David Ignatius from the Washington Post convened a panel once, and he asked 4 or 5 people to come who had been participants in Track 2 dialogue the last several years. And he asked all of them at the end if they believed that the Iranians were truly ready to reach a modus vivendi with the United States, if there was truly a will within Tehran. And everyone said yes, apart from one individual who had actually was the only one who had actually met with the supreme leader himself, Ayatollah Khamenei. And let me just tell you a brief anecdote. Last year, I was in Oslo, and I was at a private meeting, and the keynote speaker was the former president, Mohammad Khatami. And in his public remarks, he said, there are those in both capitals, both Washington and Tehran, who don't want to have relations. It's not in their interest to have relations. And afterwards, Khatami and I were seated next to each other, and we had a long talk. And I said to him, well, Mr. Khatami, I live in Washington, so I have an idea of who those individuals are in Washington who don't want to have relations. But to whom are you referring in Tehran? It's opposed to their interest to normalize relations with the United States. And he said to me that Mr. Khamenei, the supreme leader, once told me that we need this enmity with the United States. The revolution needs this enmity with the United States. So I truly think that, for someone like Khamenei,
Why do you think that is? Why do they need that?
What I'll say is that he was chosen to replace Ayatollah Khamenei because he was going to remain loyal to the ideals of the 1979 revolution and remain loyal to Khomeini's vision for Iran. And if you really distill the revolution down to its essence, there's three symbolic pillars which remain. Marg bar Amerika, death to America. Marg bar Israel, death to Israel. And the hijab, which is a symbol of Islamic piety. And I truly think that Khamenei believes, this is the argument that so many of us have made throughout the years, is that if you engage Iran, you reintegrate it into the global economy, you reintegrate it into the fold of, into the global community, it's going to expedite reform, it's going to expedite change. I firmly believe this. But Khamenei is not an idiot. He understands that argument quite well as well. And I think for precisely that reason, he's opposed, because it's a threat to his own personal interests. And again, I think this was what was great about the Obama approach, is that it exposed him. It made it clear to everyone that it's not Bush, Cheney, it's not the United States that's the impediment, it's Khamenei. And his modus operandi the last 20 years, he's had a great gig because he's wielded power without accountability. It's a very interesting model. If you do a Google search for Ahmadinejad, 10 more million hits come up than a Google search for Khamenei. But in reality, he wields the vast majority of the country's constitutional authority. And what's very interesting is that, having been based in Tehran myself, whenever people complained in the past about the government, they would say, well, Khatami, didn't do anything. Khatami didn't fulfill these promises he made of economic freedoms and social freedoms. Ahmadinejad has ruined the economy. And always the president bore the brunt. And now what's transpired the last 2 weeks is that Khamenei has been exposed, basically. And he's lost tremendous
The crisis
political
flushed
capital.
him out.
Yeah. A long answer to your question, however, is that I'm of the belief that more dialogue, these Track 2 settings are never negative. I don't see anything negative to come out of them. I just don't have great expectations of them.
Yep.
Hello? Somewhat related to what you were just talking about. How are laws made in Iran before the election? Let's just look at it that way. Who really made the decisions, or how were laws made? And you mentioned that if Moussaoui had won, that you thought that reforms would be able to be facilitated. How would those reforms have been done? How does it work?
Well, there's the Constitution of the Islamic Republic. And basically, you have a system which ascribes the vast majority of constitutional authority to the country's unelected leadership. Entities like the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, the Assembly of Experts, these very kind of arcane Byzantine bodies. I joke that, for example, the Assembly of Experts is a group of 86 clerics, and their average age is deceased. I mean, people, they wield power behind the scenes. No one really knows who they are. And then you have the elected representatives. You have the president, the parliament. And what's happened, especially the last decade, is that Khamenei has emerged as kind of a Shah wearing a turban instead of a crown. What I mean by that is that anyone who wants to run for office in Iran has to be vetted by this body called the Guardian Council, which are 12 individuals who are either directly appointed by Khamenei or indirectly appointed by Khamenei. And so anyone who wants to run for president has to be, it has to be okay that they're individuals who are going to remain loyal to the ideals of the revolution. And I think what happened with these elections is that Mousavi certainly was not the ideal candidate for reformists. 67-year-old guy, fairly uncharismatic, soft-spoken. No one expected this movement to garner the type of steam that it did. And I think certainly Khamenei didn't expect this, or else he wouldn't have allowed Mousavi to run. And what I tell people, this is kind of a departure from your question, but Mousavi's candidacy was much more akin to John Kerry in 2004 than Obama in 2008, in the sense that people weren't necessarily so passionately for Mousavi, but they were very passionately against Ahmadinejad, just as people were passionately against George Bush in 2004. And so pre-June 12th, pre-election, Mousavi couldn't publicly challenge Khamenei. Everything they were going to do was going to be within the confines of the system. That's changed dramatically since June 12th. And now people are calling for profound reform, a removal of the institution of supreme leader, removal of Khamenei, etc. And as Chris mentioned in the introduction, people are not using the word enqilab, which means revolution. But essentially, that's what it is. It's a profound evolution or a profound reform of what the Islamic Republic currently looks like.
So what could have happened is if Mousavi had won...
Excuse me, speak up a little bit.
Sorry. Are you saying then that had Mousavi won without, really won without all the problems now, that there might have been less reform than there could be because of the result that happened?
Absolutely. This is exactly what would have happened. Had Mousavi won outright June 12th, I think, we would have had an Iranian president who's no longer going to deny the Holocaust. It's not necessarily, stylistically, there would have been a lot of changes. But in terms of Iran's foreign policy bottom lines on the nuclear issue, on support for Hezbollah, on support for Hamas, in terms of its opposition to Israel, we wouldn't have seen profound changes. And this is why I say that I think if Khamenei had to relive the last 3 weeks, he may have done things differently now.
Hi, John Debs from Palo Alto. My question is, I had dinner with some Iranian friends last night, and I said, well, what do you think could actually change the situation? They said it would have to be a split in the mullahs, where the mullahs actually came to the supreme leader and tried to force him into change or get rid of him. What are the odds or possibilities of that?
What I would argue is that what's taken place in the last decade in Iran is that the institution of the Revolutionary Guards has gradually eclipsed the institution of the clergy in terms of its political and economic clout. And neither of these institutions are monolithic. You have hardline clerics, you have moderate clerics, you have hardline Revolutionary Guardsmen, more moderate Revolutionary Guardsmen. My point is this, though, that there are deep splits amongst the clergy already. As I said, very few Grand Ayatollahs have endorsed Ahmadinejad's election. But I think what's more important now is to see fissures within the Revolutionary Guards, because it's not the mullahs who are out in the streets bashing heads and making sure the population doesn't rise up. It's not the clergy, it's the Revolutionary Guards. And what I will tell you about the clerics is that this body I was talking about earlier, the Assembly of Experts, who have the constitutional authority to anoint and remove the leader, they don't have a great affinity for Ayatollah Khamenei. Khamenei, when he was chosen to replace Khomeini, had inferior clerical credentials. He was what they call a Hujjatul Islam instead of an Ayatollah. He had the equivalent of kind of a master's degree instead of a PhD. But he was given, this title of Ayatollah, And I tell people it's kind of the equivalent, again, of someone with a master's degree being named dean of a university. So you're presiding over this institution with PhDs, and you have a master's degree. So already you're coming from a position of insecurity, and people resent you. But Khamenei has wielded his power, his modus operandi has been quite Machiavellian, in the sense that I think he's more feared than he is liked. And so I know that people, Rafsanjani, for example, has been trying to agitate behind the scenes against Khamenei in Qom. And what he's found is that these senior clergy, it's not that they, again, have this deep affinity or respect for Khamenei like they did Khomeini, but at the moment they're afraid of agitating against him, and they're reliant on him economically. But when and if people sense that there's a tipping point, there's a critical mass, I think we could see a dramatic change. And as we've seen over the last few weeks, more and more clerics have been outspoken. But again, I would keep my eye out on Revolutionary Guardsmen and former Revolutionary Guardsmen and their statements, because I think fissures within the Revolutionary Guards are going to be far more damaging than fissures amongst the clergy.
How important do you think the Revolutionary Guard was in fixing this election, if in fact that's what happened?
I think that Ahmadinejad's government is essentially, it's almost like a cartel network. It's a group of hardline clergy and hardline Revolutionary Guardsmen who have a tremendous interest in retaining retaining power. A friend of mine who is a professor at Tehran University, who a lot of these Revolutionary Guardsmen studied under him, was telling me, this government made $300 billion in oil revenue these last 4 years. That's not something that they want to give up very easily. And again, I think that Ahmadinejad has really indulged the first, second, and third tier leadership of the Revolutionary Guards, and Khamenei has as well. But the rank and file, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're more reflective of Iranian society at large, and they're not simply 120,000 fanatics who are willing to martyr themselves to retain Ahmadinejad's presidency.
So you think Khamenei is vulnerable and that he's taken something of a hit during this crisis?
Certainly. I mean, individuals, I'll give you two examples of individuals who are interesting litmus tests, interesting individuals to keep your eye out on. One is the Speaker of the Parliament, Ali Larijani, who has been one of Khamenei's most trusted lieutenants the last decade or so, who despises Ahmadinejad and who said that he's publicly expressed great ambivalence about these election results. Another is the mayor of Tehran, who himself was a former senior Revolutionary Guard commander, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who also despises Ahmadinejad and who said that people should be allowed to peacefully demonstrate. So we're already seeing somewhat these fissures. And again, what's transpired over the last, it's an odd dynamic, because people sometimes say that Ahmadinejad is a very skillful politician. I would say, on the contrary, he's an inept politician, because he gratuitously alienates even hardline conservatives. Whereas, Khamenei, I think, has always been much more cautious and trying to build consensus and making sure everyone is beholden to him. Ahmadinejad has profoundly alienated a lot of people. And I think that people are beginning to question Khamenei's judgment that, why is he sticking with this president despite all of the mismanagement which has taken place the last 4 years.
Sir.
I read an article recently that was comparing the '79 revolution with what's going on now. And this particular writer said that what's going on now is not as encompassing as it was in '79 in terms of the number of cities involved and also the parts of the population that were involved. Today, there were only primarily young students, but not any of the farmers, not any of the older line people. What is your feeling on that?
I disagree with that. And I can tell you that, listen, the regime kicked out all foreign media. So all we've seen from Iran the last 2 weeks are these people who have been reporting with their cell phone cameras. And there have been huge rallies in cities like Esfahan and Shiraz in Tabriz. The Bazaar of Tabriz went on strike the other day. And if you watch these protests in the street, Iran is a very young population. 2/3 of the country is under 33. So certainly it's going to be a lot of young people in the streets. But the chants have not been secular chants per se. One of the things people are saying is, Ya Hussein, Mir Hussein, which is traditional Shiite chant. One thing which transpired in the late 1970s and 78 was that when the Shah cracked down on people and killed people, well, in the Shiite religion you have mourning ceremonies on the 3rd day, the 7th day, and the 40th day. We're seeing that as well. I've seen video footage of bus drivers who are out in the streets protesting. Garbage men, there was a video of garbage men who are out in the streets protesting. And what I would say is that Ahmadinejad has been bad for all Iranians in terms of his economic stewardship. Inflation, which has doubled to 30%, affects the lower income classes as much as it does, or even more than the upper income classes. And one point I would like to make is that there's sometimes a misperception that if you're a religious Iranian, you support this government. And I can tell you, my father comes from the traditional middle classes, and his family is very religious. And in a way, the more traditional classes are as, if not more outraged than some of the secular classes. Because they say, what this government has done is really alienated people away from religion. And so many of the things that are transpiring in the streets, the brutality, are done in the name of religion. And so I think that certainly many traditional Iranians, and this is why we see that some of these grand ayatollahs with real clout amongst the pious have denounced the results of these elections. So I disagree with this analysis. And one point I would make is that someone sent me an article. Someone who participated in the 1979 revolution sent me his own analysis. And he said that in 1979, it took 6 months, because the revolution didn't happen overnight in 79. It was, almost a 1-year period. It took 6 months before 1 million people poured out into the streets. Well, this one, within 2-3 weeks, you had, collectively, a few million people pour out into the streets. So I want to be very careful, very clear in stating that I'm not. I don't think even people are calling for a revolution. People are not using that term. And I'm not predicting any profound change in the near term. The regime may be able to hold on for months, if not years. I'm just saying that what's transpired in the last few weeks has been unprecedented. And I think it's going to be very difficult to put this genie back in the bottle.
One of the things we were talking about earlier, which is fascinating to me, is the way in which this movement has almost co-opted some of the slogans of the 79 revolution. The Makbar Dictator, Death to the Dictator, which is very similar to Makbar Amrika, which was, of course, the chant we heard over and over again back in 79.
Yeah, and one thing that's just very interesting, which also emphasizes your point, is that in 79, one thing people did at night in 78 was that at night they chanted Allahu Akbar, God is great, which is certainly not a secular chant. And now, again, people are not pouring out into the streets as they did 2 weeks ago, but people are saying that the chants of Allahu Akbar are so loud at night. And you can watch it also on the internet. People taking videos, it's very loud, people chanting this. And just an aside, I was talking to a friend of mine whose uncle is a Revolutionary Guardsman in Tehran. And like military throughout the world, Revolutionary Guards oftentimes live in the same neighborhood, pockets of neighborhoods in Tehran. And he was telling me that his uncle was saying that in his neighborhood of Revolutionary Guardsmen, the chants of Allahu Akbar were quite loud as well. So I think that these fissures, which we may not see yet, have just started. And I think we may see them, as this repression persists, I think we may see it accentuated over time.
And that's actually continuing, isn't it? That the chanting at night.
The chant is loud as
and it goes out,
as ever.
What, 9 o'clock at night or something?
Yeah,
like that?
it's kind of at dusk, around 9:30, 10 for half an hour, and people chanting very loudly.
Very interesting. Sir.
Hi, I'm from Japan. And how do you think about the Japan option in terms of nuclear issue in the long run? Of course, you do not support in the shorter term. talks. Japan is a very good boy, good student under the regime of NPT, IAEA, and so fully complying with the its restriction and internationally recognized and verified as a highly developed nuclear technology, but without nuclear arsenal. But I'm not asking about technical issue. I'm asking about Iranian pride. Are Iranians, in the long run, are satisfied with Japan's position? Highly developed nuclear technology, but not nuclear arsenal.
Without weaponizing.
Basically, getting to the same point that Japan is, where they have the capability,
not like
but
United
not
States
exercising it,
and
yeah.
UK.
Yeah, I mean, a few weeks ago, I think, if we were having this conversation, I would tell you that that's, I think, what the Iranian government had in mind is the Japan option, which is it's not the North Korea option or the Pakistan option to actually detonate a bomb and cross that threshold. I think they recognized that doing that would augment their vulnerabilities more than their security. So they were pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. And I think, though, that their calculations may have changed in the last few weeks. And given the fact that they have ceded so much legitimacy, they may well calculate that that's what we need to regain legitimacy to actually pursue that option. In terms of popular sentiment, what I would simply say to you is that this is a population, the Iranian population, which endured a very brutal war with Iraq, one of the bloodiest wars of the second half of the 20th century, about 500,000 casualties. And not one family was left unscathed by that war. Whether you had a child who died or you knew a relative who died. My point is that people don't romanticize about the prospects of conflict or militarization. And there's really no boogeyman for the Iranian people as there are for, say, the Indians or the Pakistanis. So, people, when I was based in Tehran, people would say, well, what are we trying to show to whom? Saddam is gone. We don't have any enmity towards the United States. There's no particular enmity towards Israel. They don't necessarily like Israel, but Iranians are Persian, not Arab. There's no land or border disputes with Israel. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that certainly Iranians are quite proud, nationalistic. But I think that this is a country, a civilization which goes back 2,500 years. And I think people's source of pride is not enriched uranium. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, I think we'll have to wind it up. Thank you very much, Karim.
Thank you very much. Thank you.